Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is our second half of our lecture on absolutism in Western Europe. Before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause, jot down that lecture outline, and pay attention to those key terms. Okay, let's pick it up where we left off, which is with the Spanish Empire during the 17th century. Now, the golden age of Spain was mostly in the 16th century during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. And of course, we all talked about that previously. And it does lay the foundation for absolutism in Spain, which will take place under Philip II. There we go. Spain's power will reach its zenith during Philip II's reign between 1556 and 1598. Again, they're a little bit earlier in absolutism than, say, France's. But you're also going to see a steeper decline, which we already discussed with the War of Spanish Succession. Madrid becomes the new capital of Spain. Philip II will also build the Escritorial Palace to demonstrate his power, much like the Versailles Palace in France. And we see the use of the Spanish Inquisition to persecute those seen as heretics, especially Jews and Moors. So they have all the classic ideas. They have a strong standing army, strong navy. But they begin to decline in the 17th century. Again, this is one of the issues of absolute monarchs. We saw it with Louis XIV, all of his wars. We see it again here in the 17th century for the Spanish Empire. The Spanish become very hurt by the loss of the middle class of the Moors and Jews. The population of Spain shrinks between the 1550s and the 1650s from 7.5 million down to just 5.5 million people. That's a 2 million person loss. That's 2 million people who could contribute taxes or knowledge or expertise to their society. Spanish trade with its colonies began to fall by more than 60% during the 17th century, largely due to Dutch and English competition. National taxes hit the peasantry extremely hard, which pushes peasants from the countryside into the cities, which become one of the worst slums in the world. But more importantly was, again, this issue of war. So symbolically, in 1588, you have the Spanish defeat of the Spanish, or you have the English defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, which is usually when historians view as the decline of the Spanish Empire. However, just note that until about the mid-1600s, the mid-17th century, Spain is still a very formidable military. However, it's poor leadership by 3 successive kings that is really going to destroy Spain's political power. Philip II was at his height, but Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II, who was one of the worst rulers in Habsburg history, become 3 kings in a row who hold absolute power but destroy the Spanish Empire. Spain's defeat in the 30 Years' War was both a political and economic disaster. Spain loses the Netherlands. Portugal establishes independence in 1640. And ultimately, in 1659, the Treaty of Pyrenees, that's Pyrenes, marks the end of Spain as a great power. It lost parts of the Spanish Netherlands and the territory in northern Spain to France. By 1700, the once mighty Spanish Armada, the Spanish Navy, was down to just 8 ships. And most of its army were foreigners. Think about that for a minute. I said at the beginning of this lecture, in part A, that to be an absolute monarch, you need a strong national army, not of mercenaries and foreigners. Most of their army is now foreigners. And then ultimately, the War of Spanish Succession, 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, is what's going to be the kind of final nail in its coffin, as they lose many in most of their European possessions. So it's a very short talk in the 17th century when it comes to Spain and the idea of absolutism. But you see both the good of absolutism, the bureaucracy created under well, Philip II, but also in Louis XIV, but also the negative with all the wars of Louis XIV and now the issue of war in Spain. So how do we reflect this in art? So what does Baroque look like? Well, first of all, Baroque takes a turn. It very much reflects the idea of grandeur, of the absolutist ideas. So while Baroque begins in the Catholic Reformation to teach in a concrete, emotional way, it's encouraged by the papacy. It becomes spread into these absolutist nations as a way to personify and overwhelm the viewer by emphasizing grandeur, emotion, movement, spaciousness, and unity, starting to create a more national identity, to make people proud of their country, proud of their absolutist monarch. You see some examples of architecture here when it comes to the Versailles Palace, also the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in Russia. You also see Frederick I in Prussia begin building his palace in Berlin in 1701, because these are symbols of a great, powerful, absolutist ruler, sovereignty of a great nation. It overwhelms the viewer. Think about the White House in the United States, and also out of the time frame. It's the same idea. It's meant to overwhelm and consume the visitor. In Baroque music, you see the creation that the text should dominate the music. Lyrics are more important to overwhelm the viewer, the listener. It becomes a more modern system by using dissonance. It's a modern system of tonalities using dissonance. Again, you use dissonance to keep the person on edge and overwhelm the listener, the audience. And you see three very famous people you should know. Claudio Monteverdi, who develops the modern opera and orchestra. You have, of course, Johann Bach, one of the greatest of all the Baroque composers, who brings in both choral and instrumental variety of instruments, using organs and concertos, again, to create this dissonance during the operas and plays. And of course, George Handel, who, like Bach, will span genres. And again, these are three of the ideas that and we still know, like Bach is well known today because it carries on because it's overwhelming to the audience. We also see painting take a change here. We develop what's called French classicism. Remember I told you that France became the center of the art and literature. And we see Nicolas Poussin, who is a painter who organizes his painting to achieve harmony and balance. Even his landscapes are orderly. He focuses on classical scenes of antiquity or biblical scenes, but later focuses on more landscape. It's not typical Baroque, because again, it's trying to create a little more order out of the chaos of Baroque's overwhelmingness. That's why we call it French classicism. It's an evolution of the Baroque system. And of course, he'll be temporarily in the court of Louis XIII as a painter of the court. The second one is Jean Racine. He will have a number of plays that are written in a very classical style and known some very intentional emotional work, very intense emotional works. And finally, Jean-Baptiste Molière, who's a dramatist, who will focus on the social struggles, makes fun of the aristocracy, the upper bourgeois, and high church officials. Again, not the king himself, but again, these are classic themes and classic tropes. Again, representing that turn to absolutism under Louis XIV, Louis XIV. I think it's a good place to stop for today. We'll pick up on how this developed elsewhere, because not everywhere can be absolutist. We will see other forms of rule, especially when it comes to England, who has to deal with Parliament, which will never be able to achieve an absolutist state. But that'll be a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.